I am Mark Moody-Stuart, and I'm here to hang out on this MOOC on the subject of oil, gas, and mining and governance. I must say you've sent in a very exciting set of questions. They're excellent questions. There are about 10 of them, and they're on various aspects of resources, and I will endeavor to answer them in the next hour or so. Based on my own experience as a long-term oil, gas, and mining person, still with interests in the oil industry. So taking the first question, which I think is a very interesting one, it's that the question was that the big bane of the national oil companies is that their governments that control them drain them of capital so they can't develop. Why does this happen, and what would be the best way of partnerships between oil companies and governments to avoid policing? And linked to that question, I think, is a second question, which are what are the requirements of good governance of those national petroleum companies? Can developing rentier states escape the resource curse? Well, those are two very interesting and very big questions, I think. Taking the first part of it, why is it that major national companies struggle sometimes? Well, in the question is the reason that their governments very often do drain them of capital. And this has been almost universal. When the government, particularly a government which is very dependent on resource revenue, comes under stress, sometimes wants to subsidize things, it draws on its main source of income, which is the oil company, and then that oil company is unable to expand. It's not inevitable. Norway is an excellent example, and it's a relatively small country with a lot of oil and a relatively small population. More oil, I believe, per capita than Saudi Arabia. And it's done a very good job in avoiding the resource curse. It has not joined the European Currency Union. It has its own currency, which probably is a bit overvalued. But it has used its resource income to build infrastructure and to build other industries, starting with those high-tech industries related to the oil service companies, so underwater technology for the oil industry and so on. But if you go to Norway, you will see a country in which the infrastructure has been spread around the country to rural areas, very high standards of public services in rural areas, and also the development of these relatively high-tech industries and an excellent education system which existed before the oil industry. So that's a good example. And Statoil has gone international and explores elsewhere, although its main activities are in Norway. The other good example, I think, is Saudi Aramco, on whose board I sit. Saudi Aramco has, over the generations, over the 70 years of its existence, been protected by successive Saudi governments, Saudi kings. It started off as a private American company, an American company owned by a number of US oil majors. And in the 70s and 80s, it was progressively nationalized. But in many ways, it kept the ethos of the original founding companies. The just stepped down oil minister Ali Naimi was a product of the company. He joined it as I think a late teenager, as a messenger boy in the office. His talents were recognized. The US companies, in an enlightened way, educated Saudi staff. They needed educated Saudis. They sent Ali Naimi to school and then to higher education, initially, I think, at the American University in Beirut and then in the United States. And he has maintained, and his successors and the ethos of the company has always been one of very international, technological, ethical approach. And to complement that, successive Saudi governments, Saudi kings, have protected the company and not permitted other organs of state to interfere with it. Not completely. The success, and it is a highly successful company, and a company on which I'm proud to serve on the board of directors, run, as I said, to high standards of international governance, has occasionally been called on to do things apart from paying tax and dividends to the government, to do things itself because of its efficient construction method. So, for example, the late King Abdullah asked Aramco to build a world-class postgraduate university, which they did extremely efficiently. And I personally think that was a good idea. I mean, I think it's a good investment, and who better than a highly technological company with many scientists to help do that. But it's not really the job of an oil company. And arising from that, which I think has been successful and is internationally acclaimed, I think, arising from that, Aramco has also been asked to fix the flood damage drainage around Jeddah, for example, in the light of some tragic accidents, and then even further away from their core job, to invest in or to build some football stadiums. Now, those are, in relation to the income, relatively minor, but in some cases, of course, in other countries, it's much worse. Petrobras, in spite of having been partially privatized, has foreign investors, but those minority investors have been thoroughly oppressed, I think, by the government, who has used Petrobras to support subsidies, and as we now see in the newspapers, funds, sometimes not entirely honestly acquired, to support political ambitions. That's very tragic, because Petrobras was and is an excellent technological company. But the other examples around the world, if you look at PDVSA, the Venezuelan state oil company, it's been depleted of both people and people removed from it for ideological reasons, and of funds. And frankly, it's a disaster. And the National Iranian Oil Company has likewise suffered. Part of its problems, of course, were caused by sanctions from the outside, which have tended to concentrate such economic activity as there is in the hands of the government, who then use it as a political tool to reward their friends and cronies. So those are, I think, some of the bad examples. Pemex is a company which again has been depleted financially. So what's the answer? Well, I think we see in two or three things. Firstly, the company itself, as does Saudi Aramco and Statoil, and I didn't mention Petronas, which I think is another successful company in Malaysia, have used their skills to try and grow ancillary industries. So to grow, in the case of Norway, deep water expertise, engineering expertise, construction expertise. And Aramco is also trying to do that, to develop non-oil affiliates, and not affiliates, a non-oil industry, by support through contracts, training, secondment of staff, and so on. So that's one possibility. The other possibility, I think, is actually the route that Pemex is now going down, which is to try and go into partnership with foreign companies or overseas outside investors or private investors generally, so that you use the capital, not the national capital, which is needed for other things, for education, for healthcare, and so on. So you do not draw on the national capital, you release that capital demand, which can be deployed elsewhere. And that is what Pemex is now trying to do. It's what PDVSA tried to do in the 90s and was prevented by the Chavista government subsequently, and that was all reversed. So I think trying to work in partnership with major international service companies and oil companies, in Pemex's case with service companies for a long time, now coming up with international companies. And examples of successes of that approach, I think you could look in the Gulf area, in the GCC. The Abu Dhabi National Oil Company has partnered, 60% ownership by them, 40% ownership by foreign companies, but largely operated by the foreign partner with guidance and assistance and some staffing from ADNOC. I think they've managed to do that quite successfully. And they have really push the international operators into something that they don't normally do, which is to operate on what's essentially a service fee. So an income per barrel. That to some way is what upcoming exporters, significant exporters such as Iraq are trying to do. But it's then a question of trying to make sure that your terms are sufficiently attractive to actually attract international capital and technology. So the second part of that question, I think, is, or the second question was, what are the requirements of good governance of those national petroleum companies? And I think the answer is clarity, public accountability, transparency, operating to international standards and international accounting standards, I think is extremely important. And I think it's important that they should publish those and be publicly accountable for the efficiency of the company, even if the company is 100% state-owned. And that, I think, is important. And we've seen failures of transparency in Nigeria, for example, with the Nigerian National Petroleum Company, which I hadn't mentioned before. The second part of that question is, can states escape the resource curse? Well, I think the answer to that is absolutely yes, but it's not given. By the resource curse, we mean the Dutch disease, the overvalued exchange rate, the crowding out of other industries, perhaps of agriculture, the squeezing of other industries, and some of the things that sometimes then follow when a government becomes very dependent on a single source of income, corruption, and so on. Again, transparency is, I think, the answer. And there are examples. People normally point to the bad examples where oil income has not generally benefited the state as a whole. Perhaps the original example of that was Venezuela, and currently, of course, Nigeria, although I think Nigeria is working hard to try and resolve that problem. But I always point to two other examples. One is Malaysia, which in the late 60s, early 70s, when I was first acquainted with it, was a state which was very heavily dependent on primary industries, on oil and gas, on rubber, on tin, on natural resources, palm oil, and so on. And over the subsequent 40 years, it has transformed itself into a modern, light manufacturing-based company. It's going through some difficult times now. It's the suffering from the curse of corruption. The Prime Minister, Najib Razak, has been, it's public knowledge that you can see photocopies on the internet of some $700 million arriving in his private bank account, which does not seem to have been very well explained. So I think corruption is a problem, and eventually, as always happens, these things will emerge. But nonetheless, the history prior to that, I think, was not perfect, but very good. Oman in the Middle East, a country with relatively small oil production and large population, has been transformed from what in the 60s, when I first worked there, was a very medieval country with very limited education, essentially 2 doctors for a couple of 1.5 million people, so very poor medical care, and so on, into again a modern country with a good distribution of income, good education system. People from the region send their students to the Sultan Qaboos University, and to a healthcare system which has been praised by UNDP. In fact, the whole country on development indicators has been held up on healthcare and so on. And that, I think, comes down to wise government. And in the end, government is the key to it, and I will come back to that later. With a bad government, you don't get anywhere. The question is, of course, how do you know a good government when you're voting for it, if you're allowed to vote for it? So I'm going to move on, otherwise I'll run out of time. The third question is also interesting, that it suggests that I've highlighted how the oil and gas industry has changed in the last decades, leading to a different dynamic between the industry players. Service companies compete with IOCs to offer services, technology, and know-hows to national oil companies. National oil companies aspire to become international oil companies, operate internationally using the operatorship capabilities developed in country, and integrated companies, international companies, split up to become independent. That's a pretty good summary, I think, in the question of indeed what has happened. Basis for the question. Then comes the actual question. All this being considered, who do you think will be the key players in the oil and gas industry in the next 10 to 20 years? Well, I think if you look at that history, each of those players, national oil companies, international oil companies, and service companies, had particular characteristics and strengths. The national oil companies' basic birthright was access to the national resources. So they had preferential access to those resources, which was very valuable if used wisely. The international oil companies had access to capital and technology, which they had developed, sometimes in cooperation with the service companies. What you see is where those international companies were blocked off in the 70s from access to the mainly Gulf OPEC, well, all the OPEC countries, but particularly in the Gulf, they took that. They thought the end of the world had come because their major reserves in countries such as Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, the GCC, Kuwait, etc., the whole of the Gulf, had basically been taken away from them through part or entire nationalization. And indeed, they did think the end of the world had come. But they took that capital and technology and opened new areas in the North Sea and in the Alaskan North Slope. And those areas, ironically, were only successful. They would have been a disaster had not OPEC taken action to increase the price of oil. So I worked in the North Sea in the 70s, and our skins were saved by the oil price rise. The projects in frontier areas had major overruns, more challenges than were thought, and the oil price fortunately went up. If it had continued at the pre-OPEC oil price, none of those things, either in the North Sea nor Alaska, would have been profitable. So, in a way, the OPEC activity of raising the price drew in competition from new areas. Now, those of you who read the papers now and read about shale oil and so on will say, yeah, we've heard that story once before and we can see it happening again. And it is exactly what's happening again. That's one of the entertaining things in the industry and indeed in life, is that history does repeat itself, because we're not terribly good, unfortunately, at learning the lessons of history. We tend to have short memories and new ambitions and dreams. Not that, I mean, new ambitions and dreams are a good thing, but I'm not against them. But we do need to take into account the lessons of history. So, if you look at that situation, I think you can see, if I go back to the question of who will be the key players. The key in that is capital and technology and access to resources. Now, the majors in their heyday, unfortunately, sometimes in the 90s, slowed down their research and allowed the service companies to pick up a lot of the ideas and to run with them and develop them, working with independents. So the technology of the service companies is now, in general, every bit as good as those of the best international majors. Interestingly, of course, the national oil companies, a company like Saudi Arabia, also has technology, which in my opinion is also every bit as good and sometimes better than those of the international oil companies. And that has been developed by working with the service company industry in an encouraging way, and it has resulted in a highly technological company. So you see shifts in the power. And in answer to your question as to who will be the key player in the oil and gas industry in the next 10 to 20 years, the answer is who has the technology. Not just has access to the technology, but knowledge of how to apply it and to continuously improve it. Because if you don't continuously improve it, you will fall behind. But that is useful and essential. I'm a great believer that technology will provide many of the answers and provide leaps forward, whether it's through horizontal drilling, steerable mud motors, fracking, and so on. Those are technological advances, a lot of electronic downhole control, smart wells, and so on. That is one key. But you also need access to resources and low-cost resources, and that sits in the hands of nations. The last thing you need And in my opinion, it's not necessarily to be born with it, because you can probably raise it, is capital, but capital is required. So who will win? The questioner goes on to say, what could be the value proposition from the IOCs, especially once the NOCs have reached the same capabilities and standards, and recognizing that limited R&D investment will lead to limited new technology to differentiate themselves? Well, I hope they have realized that limited investment in R&D will lead to a lesser ability to differentiate themselves. But the other part of that question, saying once the NOCs have reached the same capability and standards of IOCs, in the earlier question, we saw that that's actually quite rare. Very often the IOCs have landed up, the national oil companies have landed up drained of capital by their very own governments. And the answer to that might be to partner with international oil companies, as has been done in the Emirates, for example, and as is now being done by Mexico. So there is a slot then for the national or international oil companies to bring capital and expertise and work, not to take over from, but to work in conjunction with the national oil companies, who can keep an eye on things and make sure that the nation is getting a fair deal, and that nationals are indeed developing and gradually taking over the industry. So I think there is a key there. Whether it will happen will depend on a number of other things. The other way forward would be for national oil companies to work with service companies, and that's essentially what has been happening in Mexico prior to the change in the Mexican opening to the international oil companies. The Pemex used service companies to drill wells, to develop fields, to do everything except put capital in. And sometimes they came pretty close to putting capital in. That's because the service companies were happy not to have any ownership of the oil, which is such an emotional subject in many countries. So both the service companies and the international oil companies have an opportunity to work with the national oil companies. The national oil companies have access to the reserves. And I think what we're seeing in the oil price market is a reversion to the normal commodity price curve that we see in other industry, in mining, for example, where the major low-cost producers dominate the market. OPEC's producing 30-something million barrels a day, 33 plus, out of 96 or so million barrels a day, so roughly a third, a bit less than a third, a bit more than a third. But in logic, they should really be producing a lot more than that, because theirs is the cheapest oil, and you can make a lot of money by investing in oil which can be produced at extremely low cost when the price is $50 to $60. So I think my personal belief is that we will see gradually a growth in the low-cost producers and a squeezing out of the high-cost producers. Now, the challenge for the international oil companies is that they don't always have access to the lowest cost natural resources. So they have to try and reduce the cost by technology. the question, the third question there is, do we expect ultimately international oil companies to become mostly non-operating partners who provide a share of capital for a share of the rewards, more like an investment vehicle? I think I would expect them to become providers of capital for a share of the rewards, but to take a very active operating role in partnership with the national oil companies, with an active role, because if you're going to put your money in, you want to make sure that it's most efficiently expended, and rightly or wrongly, the international oil companies think that on the whole, with the exceptions that I've quoted, they are better at it than the international oil companies, although, as I said, there are exceptions. I think the question that was not asked is the great threat for national oil companies, international oil companies, but particularly the international oil companies, is the threat of climate change, the fact that we need to decarbonize our economies, and that the demand for oil, the global demand for oil, will turn over or fall and begin to fall at some time in the not too distant future. There used to be a lot of talk about peak oil, meaning were there peak, that we were going to run out of the stuff. I and my colleagues in the industry, right across the industry, national service companies, international oil companies, have always said it's complete nonsense. There is ample oil and gas to provide. That's not the problem. The problem is that producing that causes a problem, we believe, with climate through the conversion to carbon dioxide, and technology, with or without climate, frankly, technology in renewable energy will begin to attack the market for oil. So we've seen in the past an evolution from the beginning of the 20th century, three sources of energy, oil, wood, and coal, with coal being the dominant one, wood second, and oil being quite minor, into the growth of oil, heavier oil backing out coal, because of convenience, not because of climate change. Fuel oil used for space heating and shipping and power generation was in turn backed out by natural gas, discovery of natural gas produced by the international oil companies, backing out their own other product. So those, as part of technological evolution, those companies took hydrogen and stuck it on the heavy oil and made light oil, and were getting on very well. The problem is that all of that, light or heavy, ultimately emits carbon dioxide, which we believe is causing is a major contributor to climate change. Not the only contributor. Agriculture is an enormous contributor, and our buildings are contributors through energy. The challenge for the international oil industry, and to a lesser extent for the national companies, is that demand at some point will reach a peak. So we will have not peak oil in the sense of we're running out of the stuff, but peak demand that we don't need to consume it anymore because other technologies, renewable technologies, different forms of transportation, electrical vehicles, changes in consumer habits, and so on, will reduce the demand for petroleum. It's already going down in the United States, in most of the OECD countries. It's growing in China and in the developing countries. My colleagues in the oil industry tend to think that this turnover will come somewhere in the 2030s, 2040s. I think they are I think they're being optimistic in that, as it were. I think that the change will come much earlier. My colleagues in environmental groups and in the renewable industry, I also sit on the advisory board of a wind power company, think it will come very much quicker. Sometimes they think it will come in the next 3 years or 4 years. I don't believe that either. But the answer will be somewhere in between. And the peak for demand is probably maybe less than 10 years off. And that will leave the oil producers, all of them, private or national, fighting to produce, because what you will want to produce then is the lowest cost. If you have a static market, the winner is the person with the lowest cost production. The winner with the lowest cost production at the moment is clearly Saudi Arabia. They have high technology and low cost production. But other countries also have potentially low cost production. So that, I think, will be the real challenge and real interest. Now, I've only addressed 3 of your 10 questions, so I better get on with it. There's an interesting question on offshore decommissioning. What are your views on the upcoming challenge for the oil and gas industry to responsibly decommission offshore facilities whilst managing stakeholder expectations? And what are the roles of regulator, operator, service companies, and environmental groups? And then there's a separate question from someone else who says, is there any international organization or effort that has the mandate to regulate large, medium, and small-scale mining companies to rehabilitate their mined-out lands after the life of the mine? So in both oil and gas and in mining, we have this question of what happens to the facilities when they are no longer needed. And for different reasons, this will come up at different times. I think the role of regulation is extremely important. In the offshore decommissioning, I think the role of the regulator in consultation with stakeholders is to say what level of removal is actually required. The environmental groups say everything should be removed, the seabed should go back to a pristine condition. And in some cases, this is extremely expensive and, in my opinion, quite frankly, unreasonable. On the other hand, the operators of those systems would probably say, well, they're not doing anyone any harm, and as long as we put lights on them, it'll be all right. I think that's also wrong. So again, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. I don't think we need complete removal of everything. We need to make sure that there are no hazards to shipping, that there's no pollution. Most of this is metal. It doesn't involve hydrocarbons, that the wells are, of course, properly abandoned, and that not a hazard to shipping, and not a hazard to fishing. You don't want things sticking up from the seabed which can snag fishing nets. However, those same platforms around their bases are very often havens for fish. And the very fact that trawlers can't go through there and sweep up absolutely everything, as they sometimes do, is a blessing to the fish. And they can breed there and do breed there. If you've seen offshore installations, I remember in the Far East, in shallow water installations, the local fishermen, unmanned installation, the local fishermen used to tie up to the platforms and fish round them, because they knew that there were many fish who treated the platforms as a kind of reef and swam in and out of them and felt very happy. And the water was clean and the fish were beautiful. There's a slight problem that sometimes the fishermen on these unmanned platforms would use the metal grills to build a barbecue and barbecue the fish, which of course is not conducive to reduction of fire risk in the industry. Unfortunately, so far as I know, there were no accidents, but I certainly have seen evidence myself of fishermen's barbecues on small offshore platforms. It's a matter of education, I think. So I think the answer is there's a something in between. We don't have to remove it all. For the regulator, I think, and society, you want to make sure that as the majors shed some of their assets, the majors who have perhaps relatively deep pockets, when they sell their assets to smaller operators, that those operators have the capacity to continue to do what's necessary to remove the platforms, or else the regulator should ensure that the original owner retains the liability. This, in all cases, gets into the problem that unless you have collected, that you know what it's going to cost, and you collect that money or bank bonds or something up front, the danger is that the company, particularly if it's a small company, may go bankrupt, and you're left with no one paying the bills, the essential obligations. This, of course, as we've seen, doesn't just apply to facilities. It applies to such things as pensions, to great human cost and tragedy when people thought they were going to get a decent pension, and the supporter, the sponsor for that pension, is unable to continue to support it at the anticipated levels. And in both of those cases, a smart, knowledgeable, and tough regulator is needed to ensure that proper steps, sensible steps, are taken to ensure it. I think that's an extremely important thing. We need decent, rational regulation. But that regulation has to take into account the possibility that companies will go bankrupt, and that's what you see in the mining industry, that many of these legacy mines are old mines, and there is no international organization. It has to be done on a small-scale basis, on a national basis, and one needs to get the industry together to address the question of what are called orphan mines, so mines which have been, for example, in South Africa, tailings heaps, gold mining, spoil heaps, and so on, which need. It's a very big problem. Now there is another question, one of the developing countries have had a series of legal strikes and counter-strikes for who takes the large amount. And why isn't international transparency and legal frameworks in the extractive industries not working towards the development of local areas and local governments, both provisional and national? Why have we always witnessed the extractive industries taking the profits, a large amount, and used to invest outside the country they first sought out to give them extractive rights? Well, the question of transparency, I think, is enormously important. I'm a strong supporter of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. But of course, that initiative has to, in my opinion, follow the resources, not just the transfer of resources from company to country, but what does the country do with those resources subsequently? Are they adequately spent? Are they spent to the benefit of local communities and others? Or are they spent in the great capitals, or in the worst case, actually stolen through corruption? The question of what is fair in the distribution between national, the question suggests that they're taking the investor is taking the profits, a large amount, and using it to invest outside the country. There are, of course, many cases with ongoing mining or oil industries which have been going on for 60, 70 or more years, where the local operating company has repeatedly invested and reinvested and is committed to progressively clean up fields and mines as they deteriorate. And this contributes to a better reputation for that company and that industry, and that's what is responsible. It doesn't always happen, but it certainly can be done. And I think it's important that we look at it and we get the balance right. And the balance is what the terms are depends on the quality of the resource, how economic is it to extract, what are the prospects for that particular commodity, and so on. And this is a market. If you want to get proper resource agreements, I think the allocation of them should be transparent. It should be through bidding processes where people put up what projects they would like to do, and there is a comparison. And then I think you get a genuine market, and you will see whether people, what level the market clears at, what royalty rate, what production sharing contract rate, and so on is. So I think the answer is to develop proper markets, which exist in many countries, and that's the process in many countries. And when you do that, I think you get a proper and fair allocation of resources. Now, there is an argument very often, developing countries or new countries who are about to embark on production of resources don't have the expertise to do that. I think that's relatively easily addressed through development agencies and so on, and the expertise exists around the world. And getting good independent advice, I think, is not that difficult. I'm looking to see where I've got to in the question. I think someone asked whether mining companies are well informed about the policy implications when they make their decisions in a dynamic global context. The answer, I think, to that is fairly simple. It is yes, some of them are, and some of them aren't. The question is not whether they're well informed, but probably more whether they take good decisions or not. And mining companies and oil companies are human organizations, and they and their investors sometimes get caught up in ideas which may or may not work. So it's more the quality of decision making, I think, applies equally to major national oil companies as well. So the answer is yes, some of them are well informed, some of them aren't, and they make their decisions, and some of the decisions are good and some of them are bad. There's also a question saying, do I think that some of the dominance of the major powers on the global economy has led to a decline in reference prices? No, I don't think that that's true. I think the decline in reference prices, in market prices, because they're not really reference prices, in market prices has been due to a mismatch between supply and demand. And that mismatch resulted partly from the economic crisis, which reduced economic growth in the OECD countries and in the United States, although the demand for hydrocarbons was falling in both the United States and in the OECD. But that was compounded by a drop in demand, or a flattening in demand, a reduction in growth from China, and in other areas to a lesser extent as well. That flattening of demand growth, it was still growing on a global basis, but growing very modestly. That flattening of demand growth was matched or exacerbated by a very strong growth in supply. The most obvious proximate cause of that was the success of the United States fracking industry, which, to many people's surprise, allowed over a period of 4 or 5 years a growth of an extra 5 or 6 million barrels a day of liquid hydrocarbons being put into the global market. So that, and that was stimulated by high oil prices, which had been triggered by the reverse mismatch, strong demand and relatively more limited supply. When that overhang took place, a lot of oil went into storage, and we're faced with a situation at the moment where there is a huge amount of oil in storage in many areas, more than 1 billion barrels. 1 billion barrels is a very big oil field in storage, which can be triggered in tankers, in underground storage and so on, which can be released very quickly. And the problem is not just that we need to get the supply and demand back in balance, but we need to work off the storage. We thought that this would happen towards the end of this year, 2016. It is coming into balance. You can see discussions on OPEC on restraining production somewhat to get the price up a bit, but they don't, I think, want it to go above about $60, because that would gradually, progressively, not very rapidly, stimulate the growth of shale oil production. So, no, the answer is I don't think it's the dominance of major powers. I think it's very much the market. And I find it actually quite sensible and satisfactory that whereas the market, which has been strongly influenced by OPEC and by people's perception of OPEC, that OPEC would provide upward price movement, which would give cover to expensive deep water oil, oil sands, fracking oil, and so on. Some expensive fracking oil, not all oil fracked is expensive. I think an expectation that that would continue. I think we are now entering a period of what I call normal commodity economics, which is that the major low-cost producers will continue progressively to increase their share of the market. And if you take OPEC as a proxy for that, 30 million barrels a day, 30-something million, they would gradually increase that. And the high-cost producers, oil sands and so on, will be squeezed out unless they can get the technology which reduces the cost to enable them to produce happily at shall we say, below 60 and preferably below 50 or 40. The major low-cost producers can produce comfortably at very low numbers, more than half of that. I mean, $20 I'm not suggesting it would go there, but they would still be profitable at $20. So there's a big difference. So what I think we are seeing is the reversion to normal economics. I think I more or less covered all the questions, except the last one is please comment on responsible leadership and sustainable ethics. There are many initiatives, regulations, harvesting anything is always a question of ethics as of perspective. Not sure whether that meant that ethics was subject to perspective. And he refers to the book I wrote and said, why should anyone buy your book? That's a very good question. I wrote a book on ethics and responsible business and sustainability. Not because I thought I had the answers to these, but because when I gave talks, people said, can you give us some actual examples of what happened in cases of corruption and so on? Can you give us some examples? Because when we're in business schools teaching, these examples are useful. We need real things. And I wrote the book, not because I thought that the things we'd done were all perfect, but simply that they provided examples and would give an opportunity for people, students, to discuss were the sort of things that those companies did right or wrong. Could they have done it better? I tried to tell the story reasonably honestly and leave others to judge whether we did well or badly. And the answer is, of course, it's a mixed story. Sometimes we did quite well and can be thoroughly proud of ourselves, sometimes not so. The only reason for writing the book, what I believe very strongly is that, going back to this question of resource curse, that it depends very much on the government concerned. That's not to shift the blame from companies to governments, but you can see, and I tried to give examples where the same company operated and there were good resource curse results and bad resource curse results. And the key thing is what sort of government you have. Now, for a private company, that's an important point, because I strongly believe that it's not up to individual companies to try and change the government. But if you're stuck there in a country with a lousy government and you carry on producing, paying your money to the government, after 10 years or so, people turn around and say, what were you doing? You made all this money, it's implicit in some of your questions, a lot of money, and what's happened to the country? So the question is not whose responsibility it is, but whose problem it is. And it's absolutely, when you have a bad government misspending the money, or in the worst case, stealing it, it's a problem for the company. And then the question is, what do you do? Do you walk out and leave it? You try and do something about it. I don't believe individual companies can individually try and do something about it. But I do believe that history shows that when companies and civil society and others work together, they can provide examples to a government which can nudge the government in the right direction, and they can at least present a kind of united front. And I tried in the book to give some examples of this. I'm not saying you should buy the book. That's entirely up to you. Actually, if you go on Amazon, you can read quite a lot of it. They have example pages, so you can read it for yourself and see whether it's at all interesting. But I think that's the important question, is the responsibility of business. And business does have a responsibility to express its opinions about government, not to make political contributions, not to participate in corruption, absolutely not to either of those, but to express their opinion. And that opinion is more likely to be believed and more likely to be not biased if that opinion is expressed in conjunction with civil society. And that's why I'm a supporter of the UN Global Compact, which brings together companies, I believe responsible companies, committed to high principles, but companies working with civil society and labor unions. And so whether you read the book or not, just go and do some research on the UN Global Compact and on some of the things that are done collectively there. And with that, I think I'm out of time. Thank you very much for your questions. I found them extremely interesting. And I wish you all in your different careers and paths of life, whether you're in government, seeking answers to some of these questions, or in industry, or in civil society, may you have enjoyment and success, and continue your interest in your search for the right answers. Thank you very much.